treat it is to be introduced by Mary McCleary in Dublin. Given that my ancestors actually originally came from Ireland, it makes it an even greater pleasure. And these weird signs are going to be just to tell somebody to click over the slides for me. What I'm going to talk to you about is something that I've talked to quite a lot of states about, and it's the issue of competitiveness. And why I'm talking to you about competitiveness is because many states are trying to put in place massive programs to create employment. And I was Minister of Labour in the government in New Zealand for a period of time. I was Minister of Employment, and I can tell you those things are going to fail. What makes a difference to jobs is if you are more competitive than the economy next to you, whether it's another county, another city, another state, or another country. Because jobs are created as a result of investment occurring. And whoever attracts the investment is going to get the new jobs and the new prosperity. So, here's one of my favorite people, Milton Friedman. And we can read Milton Friedman many, many times, and every time we will find that he imparts to us more and more wisdom. So, when you're looking at things that governments do, one of the greatest mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. So it's a good idea to feed hungry people, and I don't think that any of us object to doing that. But if you have to feed them tomorrow, and next week, and next month, and next year, and for the rest of their lives, are you actually doing them a favour? Maybe you're actually contributing to the problem. Because what you're looking at is the intent. It's a good thing to feed hungry people. But it would be better if while you fed them, you found a way for them to be able to earn enough money to buy their own food. In other words, to become independent. It's one of the mistakes that we make in public policy frequently, that we don't look to the end outcome. What is it that we're trying to do? We should be trying to move people from dependency to independent living. If that's what you were trying to do, you'd realize that just giving people food stamps is not going to do that. You might actually have to teach them to read and write. You might actually have to teach them language. You might have to teach them to get up and go to work in the morning. A whole lot of things that will actually make it possible for them not to be dependent upon food stamps. Competitiveness is a measure of one economy's ability to successfully improve its prosperity in the face of competition with other economies. I just read a report that was published yesterday by Chief Executive Magazine, and what they said in there is that it's noticeable, but states are becoming much more aggressive in competing with other states for investment. So if you just sit still and do nothing, you go backwards. You have to continually be aware of what other people are doing, and you have to be matching their moves. So if we have a look at the next slide, this one is worrisome, because it actually shows that the United States now ranks number 7 in the world. Just over 4 years ago, the United States ranked number 1 in the world, and had held that position for most of the preceding 25 or 30 years. I wonder why that happened. I think I know the answer. You see, investment hates uncertainty. And if you do things in government that creates uncertainty, you chase that investment away, or you make it wait until it knows what you're going to do before it decides whether it will invest here or somewhere else in the world. And in my view, some of the big changes that Washington has made are one of the reasons why America has lost its competitiveness. So that doesn't make it easy for states, but it's not an excuse to do nothing. So I'm not going to look at the national economy anymore. I'm going to look at state economies from now on. So if we go to the next slide, the first step really is to create a growth strategy. And growth strategy is one that should encourage capital investment, which will lead to job creation, which will lead to prosperity. So capital migrates to the friendliest environment it can find. At one time, that used to mean that it would stay pretty much inside your national borders. That disappeared years ago. You know, globalization is an historic event. It's not something that's going to happen. and it's growing in volume and it's growing easier every day. So the first thing that we saw that became truly fungible was money. The next thing that became truly fungible was jobs. We don't actually see the jobs disappear as the new jobs don't occur, because they've happened in Brazil, or they've happened in Chile, or they've happened in Taiwan, or they've happened in one of the other states like Virginia or Texas, rather than here in Ohio. So, lots of people question me about why I place so much emphasis on this idea of attracting investment. So you can do this story, this little mental exercise in a lot of different ways, but I've just picked a very small enterprise. And I've called it a bookstore because everybody can understand a bookstore. But if you owned a bookstore and it was a sole proprietor operation and it's starting to do really well, and you decide that you want to expand it and that you're going to employ somebody, before you can employ that person, you have to spend money on buying some extra counter space. You've got to buy an extra cash register. You've got to buy some additional shelving. You've got to buy some additional books. And then you can employ somebody. So, that remains true for every job that's created. Investment has to precede it before the job can be created. And that's something that we don't actually keep in our mind all the time. It's not something that we're readily conscious of. So, now I'm going to look at some things that rank Ohio against other states. These are indexes, and there are probably about 20 to 25 of them that you can find that are done in the United States on a regular basis. The first one there is CNBC, and they use pretty much stuff that they see in the media, the news, and talking to people in business and from their business reports, etc., and they build a profile state by state. Forbes has a quite sophisticated matrix of measures that it looks at what's likely to produce the most vibrant economy, and I'd probably say that you can place more faith in the ranking of Forbes than you can in the others. The Alec Laffer index actually puts quite a lot of weight on taxation and tax measures and the complexity of tax systems, so it's weighted that way. I'm going to show you one or two others shortly, but what you see here is that the same states sort of remain in the top 5 nearly all of the time. And the same states in recent years have pretty much remained in the bottom 5. And you can see that Ohio has remained pretty much static as well. Now that means that you're not thinking about this issue of competitiveness at a political level and at a policy decision-making level, and you're not looking for the opportunities that would move you forward. And you have to do something about that. So I'm going to show you a few more of these indexes because I want to emphasize this idea that somebody needs to be paying attention to this stuff all of the time. And if they're not, then you'll find that you're going backwards and you're not getting the jobs that should be occurring here. So if we go to the next slide, this one actually comes from the Chief Executive magazine, and it looks at states that have made progress in recent times, and you can see one of my favorites up there is Louisiana, because I did quite a lot of work in Louisiana when Bobby Jindal became the new governor there. One of the things that Bobby Jindal did when he became governor was that he mounted an all-out war on corruption. And he passed some pretty tough laws, and they also at that time introduced term limits. And Louisiana is a state that's getting on top of its culture of corruption. And I think that that's very important. But at the same time, he also started to look at all of the other things that made it unattractive to invest in Louisiana. And you can see the progress that it's made has gone from number 46 to number 14 in a period of about 4 years, 4 to 5 years. That's a huge achievement. On the red side over there, you can see some of the places that didn't do so well by doing exactly the reverse in most cases. But down the bottom here, you can see Ohio and 2012 you ranked 34 and 28, and in 2012 you ranked 35. The good news is that yesterday your ranking came out to show that you had improved 13 places. So that now you're somewhere up around 22 instead of 35. My view is that that's a reflection of some of the important things that have been happening in Ohio in recent times. Looking at how you can make Ohio more competitive, and it's starting to be reflected there. So what that says is, you're on the right track, but you need to do more of it. And if I looked at some of the things that you've been doing, I'd say that's a good starting point. But one of the critical points of competition, in my view, in the near future is going to be labour markets. And what are the constraints that you put on employers that make it more difficult to employ in this place rather than somewhere else? And you'll already know that some of the states surrounding you have made major changes to their labour markets to make their labour markets more competitive and make it easier for employers to employ. So that's going to be a challenge, and there will be other challenges as well. Now, can we just go back 2 slides, because I want to point something else out there. There, okay, looking at this one, what you'll find with those states at the top, the ones that are in the top ranking and they tend to repeat year after year, those are states that, in my view, have developed a culture of business friendliness. It's something that's in the forefront of their leaders all of the time, and they look for things that will help to make their climate, their environment, more friendly. So what do I mean by that? Some of the things are things like, if you go to get a building permit for a new factory or a new building or whatever it is, or to add an extension, in those states they actually tell you at that time when you present all of the other permits that you're going to need, and they'll start that process for you. It's not expensive to do, it's just thinking smart. It's saving the investor time. It's enabling things to happen more quickly. So we're not talking about things you have to spend a lot of money on. You're talking about things that makes it easier to do business. And in my view, what every governor in the country should do is that they should get their economic development team and they should say, your job, your primary job, is to look at what the other 50 states are doing that's going to make them more attractive to invest in than us, and then to see that we don't get left behind. And if you did that, you wouldn't have to dangle money out in front of enterprises to try and get them to come here. In my view, the best economic development strategy is not to need one. And you don't need one when you're the most attractive place to invest in. What are the most attractive places to invest in at the moment? Places like Texas, and places like Utah, and places like Virginia. And it's because they have that culture of being business friendly. And they continually remind themselves, and they remind their legislature, you do that, you're chasing businesses away from our community. The next thing I want to say is that a lot of places with their economic development teams try and attract large enterprises because it looks like a major success. But I want you to think about this. If it costs you some hundreds of millions of dollars to bring in a business with 1,000 employees, wouldn't it be better if you were able to encourage 1,000 existing employers to employ one additional person? Because I can guarantee that if you get that 1,000-person business in, it's not going to add another 1,000 employees next year. But if you've got 1,000 businesses that increase their employees by 1, there's a very good chance they'll increase it by another 1 next year. So what we tend to do from time to time is to forget about the fact that our most important investors are the ones that are already here. Our most important employers are the ones that are already here. We need to be friendly to them first. Frequently when we offer incentives to others to come in, we're expecting the people who are already here to pay the cost of bringing in those new enterprises. When I think that what we should actually be doing is rewarding them for being here and rewarding them for increasing their investment here rather than taking it somewhere else. Okay, if we could just roll forward. Yeah, okay. I got got this slide here because this is done by some people. The name of the corporation is called Thumbtack. And this is a result of surveys of the 267,000 small businesses. And it's about 7,000 to 8,000 responses. What's important about this one is that 96% of the businesses represented there employ less than 10 people. And they're the ones that we really want to get. The micro businesses, the very small businesses, and make certain that they're happy and they're likely to make the investments that will create more jobs. And you can see there when you look at that Ohio sort of sits static on 24 in four of those categories. That means you're not doing anything there. You're sitting on your hands. Now, it probably predates the last year, so that probably reflects things that were happening about a year or 18 months ago. But it's not hard to look at each of those subject areas and say, what is it that we have to do that will make us more regulatory friendly? I can think of lots of things that you could do that would make you more regulatory friendly. Just tell the business community about the regulations before you pass them. Listen to what they say, and in some cases, don't pass them. That would be really regulatory friendly. And it also just sort of seems to me to be smart. If you look at the ease of hiring, why would you want to be putting barriers in front of somebody who wants to actually hire people? You should be doing everything you can to take those barriers down. So if there's barriers there, if it's easier to hire somewhere else, you need to find out what that state's doing and see that you do the same. So, not really super smart stuff. It's just what I call sensible stuff. Okay? Now, what we hear a lot of is that the American economy has left behind the middle classes in recent decades, and that they haven't been rewarded in the way in which they should. Well, this is Ohio, and that's somebody who's on $45,000 a year, and you see the subtractions there. Those are the things that are taken out of that $45,000 before it ever gets to the employee's pocket. And when you put all of those together, you see that the $45,000 turns out to be $35,441. So those deductions are actually wages foregone. They've been taken away before you got. There's a great story a few years ago that Joe Coors decided that, having had lots of arguments with his staff about how difficult it was to raise wages, and they didn't believe him, so he made all of the accounts of their books available to the unions and to the employees, and they still didn't believe him. So what he started doing was paying everybody their gross salary in cash. And on payday, when they got their cash, they had to go to the next window and pay back their federal taxes. And then they had to pay back their state taxes. And then they had to pay back their unemployment insurance and the premium for their health care. In no time at all, everybody who worked for Joe Coors knew exactly how much was being taken out of the pay packet before it ever got to them. So, now, we go to the next slide, and you'll see that the situation is actually even worse, because this is what it actually costs the employer for that worker to be able to take home $35,000. So it costs the employer nearly $70,000 to create a job that gives the employee $35,000 in their pocket. For too long, we've been burdening employers with a whole lot of stuff that politicians thought was free because employers were paying it and they didn't have to be paid out of taxes. I also term that as wages foregone. So one of the reasons that the middle class got left behind was 50% of their potential wage was being taken away by lots of levels of taxation and other imposed costs. We're going to further develop this research so that we can add to it the other imposts that are placed upon employers as well. Things like severance taxes and a whole range of other issues that different governments have imposed upon employers, so that people can then see those transparently and say, why don't we get rid of those things? Why don't we do the very best we can to see that jobs occur, not to frighten them away? So, next one. This looks at the Freedom Index. And one of the things that we know from Freedom Indexes around the world is that The most prosperous countries are the most free, and the poorest countries are the least free. The least free country in the world for the last 25 years has been Zimbabwe, and it's the poorest country in the world. You might say, well, that's just Africa and that's unfortunate. I can actually remember when Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia and it was the richest part of southern Africa. And its government just ran it into the ground. So there is a linkage between prosperity and freedom. We do a study that looks at the 50 states of the United States, and it ranks the states in a whole range of different issues. And this just looks at where Ohio is and what kind of progress you've made in those areas of increased freedom in recent years. And the answer is not much. And some of them aren't that hard to make progress on. They're like some of the competitiveness issues that I've touched on. They're not that hard to make progress on. So, here are some things that I'd like to say to legislators. It seems obvious, but it often doesn't happen. It's really important that legislators, before they make a decision, know the likely consequences of the decision. And they need to know that in terms of the effect it's going to have on future capital investment. They need to know it in terms of the effect it's going to have on businesses' ability to compete in the global economy, making it harder for them. They need to know it in terms of the effect it's going to have on existing jobs, and they need to know it in the effect it's going to have on the creation of future jobs. So if I have a good idea as a legislator and we go through and we check off those criteria, and in each case it gets a bad mark, what do you think we should do? Well, it's pretty obvious. We should say no. But in most cases that information isn't there. And it's essential information. It can come from some of the think tanks and the private groups, but it needs to be done so that legislators make informed decisions rather than uninformed decisions. They should seek that themselves, but in the absence of it, we should force them to look at it, so they have to pay attention to it. Next one. So what are the things that create capital-friendly environments? We know most of these. The most important one is certainty. That people need to know what the rules are that they're going to have to play the game by. So if you're going to make changes to employment conditions, if you're going to make changes to taxation decisions, do it, and do it permanently, not temporarily. Because all you've done is prolong the uncertainty. If you do it and it's really bad, then no capital investment will occur and no jobs will occur. In fact, they'll go away. And probably would then change those people, those decision makers, and put in better ones. But certainty is really important. You need to know that the certainty of contract is both enforceable and it's protected. You do a deal, you don't want it to come undone because somebody's just changed the rules on it. I've been to places where it's not uncommon to get a building half built and the government then decides to withdraw the building permit. Oh, you think that's a bit surprising. Well, one of those places is Puerto Rico. It used to happen there quite frequently. Many other places that have happened, and there are places in the United States I could name as well, where at a later date some level of government has decided, oh, we don't think we really want that there now. So what do you think it does to investors when they find that the decision that they've made, the investment they've made, has just been nullified because somebody changed their mind? So those kind of things are really important. There needs to be a certainty that competitiveness is considered before regulations affecting commerce are passed. So it's very easy to sit there and say, no, we need to regulate that. Well, answer those questions first, please. I'm being very polite now, so please. Answer those questions first, because it might tell you that this isn't a really good idea. So, we go on to the last of the slides. The solutions. You need a job strategy versus you need a growth strategy versus a job strategy. And a growth strategy is about how you make the economy grow. And if you make the economy grow, you don't have to have a job strategy. You're already getting the jobs. It just happens automatically. Needs to be a belief or an understanding of basic economics. If you do this and you do this, that's what's going to happen. And don't pretend it's not. And that should be made very abundantly clear to people so that they can't avoid that reality. The key to growth is to encourage investment. It's often made too complex. We have to do all of these weird things. No, you just have to take the blockages out of the road and let people do the things that they're going to do. One of the hardest things in politics, in my view, is to learn to do two things and do them well. The first thing that's very difficult to do is to know that you should do nothing. Just leave it alone. Because when you leave it alone, it normally fixes itself. And the solution is normally better than the one that you would have imposed. So doing nothing is a really important thing that you have to learn. And the other thing that you have to learn is that there is a difference between thinking you know and knowing. You have to have research that backs up what you think is the right situation and confirms it. If you haven't got that, get it before you do anything. You need to remove distortions to investor decision making, and you need to make investors want to invest in your community rather than anywhere else. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's my talk about competitiveness, and I put a lot of ideas up there today. None of them are particularly difficult. Most of them are just common sense, and many of them are not even expensive. In fact, they're less than that. They're actually very pro-growth, and they will correct many of the problems with economies, whether it's a state, a city, or a nation. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions.
One of the biggest problems I hear from Ohio employers is workers' compensation rules and regulations. Are workers' compensation regulations fairly uniform across the United States, or is it particularly bad in Ohio, or do you know?
They vary, and they vary widely, and please don't limit it to the United States, because a lot of your competition is outside of the United States. Some of your most aggressive competition is places like Brazil, and China, and India, and Russia, as well as the small countries of South America and Eastern Europe. I've done quite a lot of work in Eastern Europe in recent years. One of the things that's interesting, the countries that came out of communism and are now part of Europe or on the verges of Europe, one of the things that they do is that exercise that I did before. What's the cost of employing somebody? The cost of employing somebody in, say, Westphalia in Germany is around 250% of the wage paid to the employee. The cost of employing somebody in Slovakia is 115%. There are more Volkswagen cars made in Slovakia than there are in Germany. In fact, there are more German cars made in Slovakia than there are made in Germany. And that's what caused it. That's the competitiveness of labour markets that are actually moving investments in different places around the world. So the answer is they are not identical, they're not even similar across the United States market. If they're bad, fix them. It might be hard, but if it needs to be done, fix them. Because if that's what's driving the jobs away, it needs to be fixed. Right, somebody here in the middle.
I actually saw that, I think it was a CFO article on that rankings a couple days ago. Why do you think we jumped 13 spots? Because I didn't think Ohio would jump that fast. Are others doing just that much worse? Or okay.
One of the reasons why I like the CFO index is that CFOs think prospectively. They're thinking about the future. They look at what's happened and they're thinking about the future. They actually see Ohio as a place that seems to be trying quite hard to improve its lot. So I think that the indications that they see that you're starting to move on some of the things that made Ohio a bad investment is encouraging to them. That's why I think you see the big jump. You would not, in my view, see as big a jump if you looked at the ranking by Forbes this year as opposed to last year, because they do it differently. But prospective thinking is the stuff that makes decisions about investment. So that's why I like that.
You mentioned that Bobby Jindal in Louisiana had done a lot to, he said one was corruption and two, I think you mentioned term limits, was that correct?
Pardon?
Term limits?
Yes, the term limits actually preceded Bobby Jindal. They took effect when he came into office, but they had just been decided, I think, the election before.
My question about term limits is, one area to look into in term limits is now you have more inexperienced legislators, and they're going to be more dependent upon the lobbyists for their information and make their decisions. So now the lobbyists potentially become more powerful than they have been in the past. Has that situation been seen there, or are my fears not real?
I think your logic is impeccable, but the results work exactly the reverse way around. So what we see with term limits is that in the past you had people who stayed in the legislature for 20 or 30 years. They had built up informal networks, and those networks were really auction places for power and for privilege. So when you introduce term limits, you break up those networks, and it takes a while for them to reform. And that's what we've seen happen in Louisiana, that those old networks have been pretty much destroyed by the turnover of the politicians. And I think that that's been good. Personally, when I first came to the United States, I did not believe in term limits. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that they would deal with some of the problems that I have with the way in which governments are performed. My view is that you should go into government, you should do your job, and then you should go home. And that if you can't do a decent job in, say, 10 years, you should leave anyway. After 10 years, you've probably spent as much energy and as much of your good ideas as you possibly can, so it's a good time to leave. So I think that, as the founders had in mind, we should have a citizen legislature that turned over fairly regularly, and people didn't see it as a career. Unfortunately, that's not the way it's developed. But term limits helps on that. Is it the panacea for everything? The answer is no. It doesn't beat people who are prepared to make tough decisions when they need to be made. It doesn't beat the kind of things that Bobby Jindal did in a number of other areas that were just smart but tough. For example, some of the things that we did on his streamlining commission when we looked at how the government spent money. So there were 3 juvenile prison facilities that we were looking at. And when you looked at them, their budget was about the same for prisons of about the same size. And so everybody said, well, they look okay. They cost about the same. And I said, no, what you have to do is that you have to go back and you have to cost those out based on the cost per person in prison per year. And we found that the one that was in Baton Rouge cost 300% more per prison per year than the other 2, because it only worked at 30% of capacity. And they kept it open because it was in Baton Rouge, and Baton Rouge is the capital city, and they didn't want to close it. But when they had to look at it being 300% more expensive, they had to make some decisions about it. So they dramatically reduced it in size. Some of the other things that he did was that he faced up to some pretty tough issues. Anybody this far north remember a guy from Louisiana called Huey Long? Sort of an American icon. But one of the things that Huey Long did was that he created the charity hospital system. And so Louisiana had the highest density of hospital beds per head of population in the entire United States, and by a very big margin. But by these times, they were finding that large hospitals were extremely expensive. And so the big hospital in New Orleans called Big Charity, they put a team of people in there and decided that they needed to restructure it. And they decided that it was grossly overmanned, and because it was designed to cope with 2,000 patients, and it was only coping with about 200 patients. So they decided that they had to reduce the staff. And they did this all within the bureaucracy, and they got the staff down to the new levels. What actually happened was that they had 2 supervisors for every working nurse, because they got rid of the nurses, but they didn't get rid of the supervisors. So Bobby Gentle had the courage to say, go back, do the darn job properly, and we're going to set a criteria that says that the supervision rate is going to be 11 to 1, 11 nurses to 1 supervisor for dealing with ordinary patients, and 8 to 1 for patients with mental health problems. So some of those are the things that he's been prepared to do, and that's some of the things that have driven the change in Louisiana. So facing up to tough issues and saying, we're not going to tolerate that any longer, we're going to do the right kind of thing. Anybody else? Yes, right here's somebody.
I just learned today, in fact, that the state of Texas and Amazon spent 2 years fighting each other in a massively ugly fight. In fact, it was so bad, Amazon left Texas for several months over it. And it was really interesting to me because that's a state that we normally have such a pro-business reputation. The question here is are some of these reputations stronger than the states actually really deserve, I guess? And there's actually a second question, if you don't mind. As a holder of an honor, are we in the United States missing something because we don't have an honor system?
That one's going to be hard to roll back. Got to go back a few hundred years. If you'd been more welcoming to people with red coats, you could probably still have honors. It might not have been a good trade-off. I think that's a very perceptive question. And my answer to you is this, that just because states rank highly doesn't mean that they're really good. It just means that they're better than the others. And also, just because you do something smartly doesn't also mean that from time to time you will do some stupid things as well. And so you get some of those cases. I think that if you dug into that to find out what drove that fight between Amazon and the government of Texas, you might find that there were some other people behind who were pushing buttons to keep that fight going. And it might have been some of the other interests that were located in Texas that were pushing those buttons. So that's not good, but it exists. So got one over here and then I'll get you soon.
Here in Ohio, we have this separate and unequal pension system, where if you work for the government, you get a gold-plated pension. Our teachers retire in the 50s. It's a very, very fine retirement system. And then we have the private sector workers that pay into Social Security. Here in Ohio, we also have a separate and unequal educational system, where in the suburbs you get the nice schools, the inner cities get the absolute awful schools. What do you think it would do to Ohio's competitiveness if we went to a Social Security choice system where people who live in Ohio could choose either the public pension or continue to pay into Social Security and have a statewide school choice system? How do you think that would help our competitiveness?
When you talk about pensions, there's often a tendency to think that the employee did something wrong. I always put 90% of the blame on the employer, because in the end they made the decision. What we've seen with public pensions for a long period of time in many states across the United States is a whole level of deceit in not properly disclosing the health of those systems, the cost of the benefits that have been promised, or how they're going to be funded. And that's starting to turn around. And I think we're going to see the accounting process for governments make it much harder to cook the books as they have been cooked in the past in many states. So that will help. How you get on top of that is, if it's underfunded, is really a different question. But the answer is you fix it. And there are ways of fixing it. I had to do that for the government in my country, and it's a bit painful, but you have to fix it. The other thing is that, in my view, defined benefit pension schemes have outlived their usefulness, and that we should be moving everything towards defined contributions. And we should give those full portability so that people can move in and out of the public sector or in and out of private sector jobs and take their pension with them, which is easy to do with defined contribution, but much more difficult to do with defined benefits. The second portion of that question is this. There's an obligation on governments to be good employers, but there's also an obligation on governments to be responsible to the people who pay the bills. And there has been a tendency in many places to make unreasonable promises because the person making the promise didn't have to pay the bill. That's unfortunate. Now, the thing about choice. The more choices I've got, the better off I am. Because what choice really does is that it enables competition to occur. And competition is what creates innovation and creative new ways of doing things. So giving people choice would mean that there would be a whole variety of different packages. And we may choose differently because we have different ambitions, rather than having a one-style scheme that doesn't suit the ambitions of some people. Some people might have the intention to retire much later in life, some might retire much earlier in life. The choices that should be available to them, but it would affect the kind of pension that they would get. So I think that when we enable choice, we certainly make everybody better off. So, yes, sir.
One of the things that we seem to have a big problem with, both in the state and in the country, obviously, is the ideology, the politics. And when we come down to getting ready for an election and so forth, promises are made that can't be kept. And also, after the people are elected and put into those positions, they change based on all kinds of forces that are working on them from the outside. And it makes it very difficult for the, shall we say, the average person, if there is such a thing, to make an impact on the government to say, hey, there's this guy that has all these great ideas, you need to sit down with him. And in 10 pages, he can show you the best ways to make these things work. So I guess my question is, are you dealing with the state of Ohio, or how do you get to the elected officials to help them understand that there is a better way and that we'd like to see Ohio succeed just as well as the country?
Okay, 2 or 3 questions there. Ideology. You know, I don't think that there's much difference between Republicans and Democrats, except when they're talking. When it comes down to the issues, both of them have successfully done very bad jobs and occasionally done good jobs. So I don't think there's so much ideological, because most of the issues, there's only a few choices, and they really divide on logical and economic grounds rather than ideological grounds. The second thing is, what you're really talking about is prospective politicians trying to bribe us with our money to vote for them. In a number of places, there's a requirement that the promises being made by the politicians need to be independently assessed and made public as well. So we do that in my country. So if you promise something, the Treasury will cost it, and it will be on the news tomorrow. And that has tended to make a lot more politicians more responsible than they were in the past, when somebody knows exactly what the consequences are going to be of the promises that are being made. There are some things that are hard to deal with, and the things that are hard to deal with are those promises that take effect at some significant time in the future, because it's very easy to say, don't have to worry about it today. It doesn't. It's like the debate over Social Security. It doesn't go bankrupt tomorrow, and it doesn't go bankrupt next year. It's somewhere around 2033. And I'm not going to be here in 2033, so I don't care that much. Those things are pretty hard to get people to pay attention to, the net present cost of promises that have already been made. And we need to do a better job of convincing people that what you're doing is that you're prejudicing the future of people who haven't yet been born, because they're going to have to pay for the promises that you made with their money. And I got a few grandchildren, I sort of like them. Well, I like them a lot. And I got a lot of pleasure out of them, and I'm not too happy about the idea of saddling them with all sorts of bills that they never, ever incurred, and is going to take away from them a lot of their liberties to be able to settle those bills. So I think there's some pretty ideological issues that we need to address in a very open manner. Part of the problems is that our legislatures do not work well any longer. And my comment about that is that a legislature is really meant to be a deliberative body. How often do you actually see your legislature acting in a deliberative manner? In most cases, it's a fait accompli by the time it gets to the legislature. In most cases, whatever it is going to be passed before you, the public, have a chance to say, I think this is a really stupid idea. Those things need to be changed, and the legislatures need to go back to being deliberative bodies. My view of a legislature is that it's a marketplace for ideas, and that there should not be any penalty or any recriminations, because in that marketplace of ideas you traded off a better idea for the one that you had. That's the way it's meant to work. There's a wonderful speech that was delivered by somebody that every American should know. He came from Tennessee, and his name was Davy Crockett. And you can Google it and you'll find the speech, and it's called Not Yours to Give. And in that speech, Davy Crockett turned the mind of every member of Congress so that what was being proposed was voted down on the basis of it wasn't theirs to give. If they wanted to give, it was about giving charity to somebody who's a woman whose husband had died, and he was a war hero, etc. And what David Crockett said to the people in the legislature was, we can give our private charity to help this woman if we want to. But we don't know that we're not taking money from other people around America whose need is greater than hers. So we shouldn't be taking their money. And he said, indeed, if each of us in this chamber were to give just 1 week's pay, we would give her more than is being proposed in this bill. And he said, I'm the poorest man in this house, and I'm prepared to give a week's salary. And so they all agreed with David Crockett. But in the end, only 10% of them ever gave a week's salary. So things then weren't too different. But what I'm really talking about is that's how a legislature should work. It should be able or possible to persuade people by the power and the logic of the arguments to change their position. And that should not be considered to be a compromise in something that is negative or bad. There was a better idea, and we settled for the better idea. One last question, right up the back.
Regarding competition amongst America and the European social model, considering the rule of supply and demand and labor being a commodity, we seem to have a free-for-all with immigration in this country. It affects not just the supply and demand, but also the social apparatus that we've created as well. A lot of the intellectual ideology imposes the European model of socialized programs and things in America. How are we competing with, because I know that Europe is having problems with immigration as well.
Okay. You see, I define the problem that America has with immigration differently. It's not a problem that you have with immigration. It's a problem that you have when your government won't enforce the laws that already exist.
Yes.
And not enforcing the laws that exist causes other problems that have been allowed to develop and evolve over 2, 3, or 4 decades until they now become something of a crisis. It's not going to be easy or clean to fix it up. The thing that we need to remember is that this country was created by immigrants, and they brought a huge quantity of talent, and they made one of the greatest countries on earth. There are 3 other places that were created by immigration that I'm immediately aware of. One to your north, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all created almost entirely by immigration. They worked out as some of the most successful of the new countries of the last 200 years. And do you know why I think they were successful? I think they were successful because at the time when those immigrants came to these countries, they had to self-select as the most entrepreneurial of the people who lived in their country, because it was a one-way trip. The cost of coming here and the disruption was so huge that you knew there was no going back. And I think that that served those countries well for the next 150 years. So, what were some of the attributes that that brought with it? A fierce level of independence, a moral obligation to looking after yourself, to providing for your family, and to helping others around you as well as you could. And socialism takes all that away. And I think that some of the countries of Europe are lesser today because they've allowed that to happen. I saw an article in one of the European papers just recently, actually early last week, and it was about France. And it said, why is France and why are French people the unhappiest people on earth? And so a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but some truth in it as well, because they have that expectation that somebody else is always going to fix their problems. My compatriots went to war twice, and so did yours, to bail the French out. We don't remind them about that enough. And I think that what we have is something that we were lucky to get, but it was inspired by our founding, so don't let us reject the thing that made it great. There are many new Americans who are incredible Americans. There are many Americans here who need a bit of a kick in the pants, and they've been here for a generation or two. So it's not necessarily just the new migrants that are a problem. But I go back to when the government decides that it's not going to abide by the rule of law, you are going to have troubles. And when it does that over a long period of time, the problem is going to get much greater. And that's what happened to immigration here. And now immigration is being blamed for it, when it's not actually immigration that caused that problem at all. And I worry that that's going to create a public backlash against the idea of immigration, when I think immigration now is important to America and will continue to be important. You need to be able to bring in the talent that you need, and it doesn't all reside here. So getting the issues soundly based and fighting them on the right basis, I think, is important. That's why I like some of the things that I see happening in Congress at the moment, because some of the members in Congress and in the Senate are saying, we can't fix this unless we fix the border first. But what I prefer them to say is that if we have laws that say our borders have to be secure, then we better enforce those darn laws that say that our borders should be secure. And it's not beyond the ability of the United States to do that. Then every person that comes in illegally, you deport them. And you can't do that, because I was Minister of Immigration and we deported 99% of the people who came into the country illegally. But we made it pretty tough to get into the country. For a start, you've got to swim 1,500 miles. But otherwise, it was still pretty difficult, but everybody knew that if you came in illegally, we were going to deport you. And unless there's a consequence for that behaviour, you're not going to do to discourage it. So, can you really blame the people who are standing all there queued up on the other side of the border looking for a better way of life when they say, hey, I can cross this line and nothing bad's going to happen to me, so, why don't I do it? The people who are allowing you to cross it with nothing bad happening to you are as much at fault as you are for crossing that line. Okay, thank you everybody.
Thank you everyone for coming. having, just one quick reminder before you go, we are having another event on June 12th. We're going to have our friends from the Mackinac Center down, and they're going to be discussing Michigan and its recent change to a right-to-work state and what that means for Ohio. So I encourage you all to register. It's going to be a great event. Again, it's on June 12th, and you can register at our website.